Hello, this is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to our Monday, April 22nd Strategic Overview. And I want to welcome you officially and formally to our Promethean PAC, formerly known as LaRouche PAC, discussion for tonight. And many of you probably heard what we have in store in terms of what the objectives and commitment of both our Political Action Committee, Promethean PAC, and Promethean Action is going to be to defining the future of what has to emerge in the midst of these next several months, very short period of time leading into the election of President Donald Trump, and what has to be defining the future in terms of the policies going into 2025. And so, again, this morning, Barbara Boyd laid out the strategic overview of where we are in this battle, in this fight to save our republic, discussing what we're seeing in terms of as the enemy of our republic, of humanity, who want to continue to push for the destruction of the United States, the destruction of the leading presidential candidate that has been going after the policies of the corrupt, insane Biden administration, of the insane wars that are ongoing. We just saw what happened with the void in leadership coming out of the Congress. And as Barbara made clear in her remarks, if you haven't had a chance to watch it, I'd encourage you to do so. You can find that on Promethean Action on the website. But as she stated, when President Trump came in, he made very clear that he was against the endless wars and continuing to put everybody first except the American people, that he saw the deep state, the imperial powers of the globalist agenda doing. And so President Trump has committed against that. And when he decided to go against that agenda, he became a target. And we see this with the insanity that's happening in the courtrooms, the Manhattan court case, what's happening in these various prosecutions, indictments, attacks against him. And we see that it's backfiring because the American people are looking at the insane policies that are going on and saying, we want no more of this. We don't want to put 60, $90 billion of funding into these outrageous illegal wars. But as Barbara said in her discussion, we can't put lipstick on a pig. We are dealing with a void in leadership in the Congress, a bunch of cowards who probably have something against them. I think this was something that Tucker Carlson said as well, looking at some of the people who were voting in favor of, putting other nations, borders, wars, so forth first, while the American people suffer. The only way somebody's going to do this is if they have all kinds of baggage and they've been threatened, as maybe that's the case with the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. But the key is we need to restore in the United States, as we're going to discuss tonight, this question of how do we end this dark age and build a new civilization. Civilization is committed to the idea of human progress, of the identity of man in the image of the Creator, and of the identity of we're not going to be made a fear to fear this oligarchy, that we have more power over them. And so I think I just want to restate the commitment that Barbara laid out this morning in her morning brief as to what our commitment is, what we want to build, what the future, what does the future lie? Where does the future lie? And so, as she said, As Promethean PAC, we will broaden MAGA to include Kennedy Democrats, to include Black folks, to include Hispanics, to include young people, and make this election too big to rig. And when you're talking about what we're seeing right now, the support, despite all of the attacks against Donald Trump, because of his commitment to making the US a manufacturing superpower, to making sure that we have productive jobs. That was his commitment, and everybody gained from it. No matter what your ethnic background was, we were actually progressing under Trump. We weren't seeing these insane wars. That we have to commit to that, because as people are saying, it's not just about Republican or Democrat. You have the uniparty structure running both parties, and we need a reemergence of a productive party that is going to encompass people who want to see a total reversal of the insanity coming from both parties. And you see this from the standpoint of the response that Trump is getting when he goes to a bodega in New York, areas where he has not, where Republicans have not been so-called warmly receptive, but President Trump represents something uniquely different. You see this when he goes to historically, speaking to historically Black colleges, or you see this when President Trump is going and just hanging out with the population, and they're saying MAGA, 4 more years, Trump. And you see this in contrast to what they're saying about Biden. It's basically, just ignoring him as just an old, senile, insane man. So I just wanted to finish with this statement saying, so with our sister policy organization, the Promethean Action, as Barbara said, we will create a consensus to take down the present Stasi and return law enforcement and intelligence to the circumscribed world, to protect us from the active threats and nothing else. And so we will create a national consensus to establish a return to national banking, prioritize funding of great projects, and make sure that those great projects are committed to rebuilding our dilapidated cities, which Trump has fully discussed and committed to, building new cities, building the energy and water infrastructure for our industrial and manufacturing, and also as prime components of our economy, and advancing agriculture, and also putting Wall Street in its place through Glass-Steagall. And finally, we will launch crash programs developing fusion energy and explore the moon and Mars, reaping the benefits of new discoveries and renewing our renewing a national our excitement around the national pride, which only such frontier measures can accomplish. And with that, last thing I want to say on this, if we're talking about a commitment to building a new civilization, committed to human progress, committed to this identity of creativity, the creativity of the human mind, man in the image of the creator, I mean, you can compare that to a nation who has a national mission, as we saw under President John F. Kennedy. Today, 2 anniversaries are commemorated. One is around the anniversary of of Earth Day. And you see all of this stuff about climate, the earth, how human beings are destroying the earth, and this idea that human beings are not committed or in the image of the creator. They're nothing more than animals. And then you see just 52 years ago, as a continuation of of President John F. Kennedy's commitment, you see what we accomplished with the policies, the program for Apollo. Today was the landing of the 16th Apollo mission on the moon. And I had the opportunity just a couple of years back to interview the youngest person, Brigadier General Charlie Duke, who flew the lunar module to the moon. And that mission was almost not a success, but because of the commitment of the Capcom on the ground, and everyone working together to make that mission a success, we were able to accomplish that goal of once again landing human beings on the moon. And it wasn't just, oh, we made it to the moon again, but it was showing our dedication, our drive, our determination, and the fact that we were committed to putting America first, industrial development, and we only got there because of the fact that there was a mobilization that had been built throughout the entire country. So when we're talking about ending the dark age conditions and bringing about a new civilization, this is what we have to commit to doing. And this is why we have to make sure that we demand put an end to this insanity that's going on against President Trump. He has to be the next president of the United States, and we have to organize like hell to make sure that that happens, and to make sure that we redefine a new national commitment and mission for the country. So I just wanted to open it up with those few comments, and I will say that if you want to hear a story about someone who really took their faith and their exploration and their discoveries of the beautiful creation of God, the Creator, and what that represented in terms of going into space and bringing that about in terms of how it changed their life and changed their relationship to Christ, to a whole perspective on what he was truly embarking upon. I'd encourage you to read the works and the story of Charlie Duke and what he was able to write about in terms of his experience. It's called Moonwalker. So it's a very fascinating book, and I think that that's just an example of what we have to recommit ourselves to in terms of this commitment to a national mission and really, really creative breakthroughs. So I will turn it over to Michael and let him expound on his thoughts and ideas.
Thanks, Keisha. Welcome, everyone, to the discussion tonight. As many of you know, as Keisha mentioned, there was a bit of a catastrophe in the Congress this past week with both the FISA bill and this foreign aid funding package going through. And at the same time, you had Trump's legal trials, the kind of circus show in New York City, which is just a mockery of the system of justice. I mean, they're basically turning the Lady Justice into the Whore of Babylon at this point. And so these things can be very aggravating. And when you have what was a somewhat speedy resolution to a threatened, escalated Israel-Iran conflict, and what all the details were behind that is unclear, but the Iranian deployment of major missiles and drones, cruise and ballistic, from Iranian soil were largely intercepted. Damage was very limited, and then Israel retaliated and was somewhat limited. But you had a certain sense of that process. You have these inflamed riots, protests, where the the cause for students on campus today is the plight of the Palestinians. Now, as some people have said, I'm sure it's very possible to find people on this planet that are suffering actually far more than the Palestinians are in Gaza. Now, to say that's the case prior to the bombing and the attacks would be maybe a stretch. I mean, is one thing. Saying it after, of course, and the attack on them is a bit more severe. But this pro-Palestinian process, this protests and these kind of rallies and this ferment didn't spring up merely on October 7th of last year. It's dominating entire college campuses, and the whole woke agenda on the college campuses is coming directly into play. And you have this sense of, and then I guess worth mentioning the whole Ukraine-Russia conflict, which we've just funded. Mike Johnson came out, the Speaker of the House, and said he's a wartime Speaker of the House. Probably the greatest aggrandizement of the position one could make. You're basically like the number 2 man in charge of running the wartime economy in the country or something. And people can get pretty overwhelmed by all these events. And then those are the larger strategic factors. This doesn't describe what's happening in your local town or city, the chaos that's penetrating into your family. The great founder of the Athenian system of government about 100 and almost 200 years prior to Socrates was a guy named Solon. Tony Papert has covered him before on these discussions. But Solon wrote a great poem, and in that poem he talks about how when tragedies unfold, it begins to penetrate into the very home. There's no courtyard which you can find safety in. There's no walls or gates that will keep the kind of the spirit of tragedy, of destruction, of chaos from penetrating even into the very family room. We might call it into the family room of American households. And Americans have increasingly felt that. There was a kind of an attempt to stave off what was a massive financial collapse in 2008-9. We've talked about this many times, but this was, it was in the tens of trillions of dollars. Was it 10 trillion? Did it cost us 10 trillion? Did it cost us 20 trillion? Did it cost us 30 trillion? There are different estimates. There are different ways of accounting. The cost it had in terms of a process. But what was clearly done was that you decided to borrow massively from the future. So our government debt went sky high, like it did with about $8 to $10 trillion for the forever wars. Our debt went sky high because of the borrowing and the debt. The Federal Reserve balance sheet went sky high because of money printing and interventions. Federal Reserve balance sheet, just to give you an idea, what the Federal Reserve has as assets, went from about $800 billion before the crash to about, we'll say conservatively 8 trillion. It's about 8 trillion now. It probably went up as high as 10 or 11. That's an $8-9 trillion just increase there. We borrowed off of the future. And that was done with intent. And they did it to buy off because young people wouldn't have a clue what was really happening. And older members of society would feel like, we're going to rescue your stock investments. We're going to rescue your retirements. We're going to rescue your home value. And those of you that have money, like we saw in COVID, this was again another example of the same phenomena. As in COVID, those with assets will massively see these things balloon upwards. And so you'll become even more wealthy financially, monetarily than you've ever dreamed. And the working class, the younger generations, which are generally working class, they don't have a lot of assets. They're basically paycheck to paycheck, if whatever that means, didn't have a clue. And this rumbles through our society today constantly. And the kids at Columbia, the privileged kids at these Ivy Leagues or universities, are once again the kind of grandchildren of the same people that were doing something similar back in the 1960s, where the baby boomers of affluent families ended up at the better schools, privileged, pampered, terrified, paranoid of the nuclear war, and basically were inculcated into a kind of outlook which was to blame the cultural outlook, the civilization, the very foundations of the United States, to say this nation, this civilization, Christian Western, Judeo-Christian Western civilization, the United States, were fundamentally flawed and should be rejected, and we should start over. We should start with new concepts. We should liberate from, sexual repression is one silly example that became increasingly dominant. Use drugs, break out of religion, break out of responsibility, break away from science, break away from industry. And all of this was done under the banner of, but we're against war. And you see the same thing with these protests today. We are against the war. We are against what's happening. What are they for? What are they fighting for? What civilization are they defending? As many people can tell, these pro-Palestinian or other types of protesters, the woke agenda, wherever it comes from, it's not like the Palestinian cause is unrighteous at this point. It's something to defend. These are vulnerable people getting, bombarded into the, tens of thousands of people killed and more potentially starving, just pushed to the brink. And for a lot of the countries in the area, it's a pretty rough neck place to live. These are not liberal democracies in the region. Most of those countries at the highest level really don't want to have to continue to deal with this Palestinian problem. So it's a tough area, but everyone can smell that these anti-Israel sentiments could very easily turn upon and be anti-America. It oftentimes comes to mind, everyone's seen this. How many times have people like, the fat slob, Chris Christie, New Jersey guy, sat there and rocked out to Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA. And they born in the USA, born in the USA. And they scream it like, yeah, I'm proud to be born in the USA. I'm proud to be born in the USA. And they thump their chests, Chris Christie types. The problem is that Bruce Springsteen was writing an anti-American song. The whole thing is basically a hatred of the United States and recognize and sees that specifically the Vietnam War was its great corruption. As many people today say, the wars of the last 20 years have corrupted the United States and it has to be rejected. Okay, so why do I say all this? Excuse me. Because this sentiment of the 1960s, this anti-American, anti-Western civilization sentiment was something that Lyndon LaRouche foresaw as a presage of something, a foreboding kind of quality. What he accurately identified as a dark age. And the problem with a dark age is that once you're in it, the people that have grown up in it, who live in it, who have acclimated to it, who have adapted to it, who watch the compromises in Congress, who watch the forever wars, who watch the financial scams and frauds and financial bailouts just go on now in perpetuity. And ultimately usher in a different sense of human identity, an identity that looks to prevail as an individual. Let me see if I can get access to the money printing. Let's see if I can become personally wealthy. Bruce Director mentioned on the Saturday class of the economic course, a growing kind of wealth within families. Not surprisingly, people have become billionaires. There are billionaires everywhere now. Well, that $1 billion at just a mere 5% treasury bond is like $50 million annual revenue if you just stuck it all in treasuries. And you're getting, who knows what you're getting on the stock market or private equity, because the market isn't even the market. There's private markets, there's off market markets, and blah, blah, blah. But the massive amount of return you're getting because of the ongoing financial printing and frauds and scams is massive money, massive, massive amounts of money. They're more dominant than even banks are because the level of free liquidity that these family funds, private equity funds, hedge funds now muster is huge financial control. You've built up an oligarchy, a kind of or a petty oligarchy. There's the more dominant oligarchy who have institutions that have governed for centuries. But you have a petty oligarchy now running around acting like they're somehow in control of society, but they run all kinds of corrupt operations. So the point here is that we are in a dark age. Our cities have been destroyed. When? They weren't destroyed in 2008. New York wasn't destroyed in 2008. It was just 7 years after 9/11. It was getting rebuilt. I mean, it wasn't a paradise. It wasn't a renaissance. It wasn't completely destroyed. You didn't have this tens of millions of people migrating into the country in any given year. You didn't have massive homeless. You didn't have the fentanyl destruction. You didn't have legalization of marijuana. You didn't have this massive printing in perpetuity. You didn't have a government that thought it could lock down its population. Even after 9/11, we didn't lock down the population. We didn't control population behavior the way we did in COVID. You didn't have young people getting taught about sexuality in kindergarten. I mean, these things weren't taking place. They were all clearly on the horizon, but they weren't yet embedded. And so, now this could seem like a real downer. You're thinking to yourself, well, it's Monday. It's already a tough day of the week. And I was having an okay day. This guy's just dramming into my head how screwed up things are. And not only is it bad, but it's like a dark age. It's like making it sound like it's the Middle Ages. It's probably worse than the Middle Ages. Never before have a population. I mean, maybe the closest comparison would be Spain in like the early 16th century, where they had gotten so much gold from the Americas, they became so degenerate. The men became so effeminate. That's what's happened to the American people. We're fat, we're slobs, we're drug addicted, we're alcohol addicted. Gambling. I mean, gambling's everywhere. You know how they tried to rebuild Detroit? They built casinos everywhere. Can you imagine going into Detroit after it's been gutted of industry with predominantly African-American population, like 80%, and saying, oh, we've got a great fix for you. We're just going to have you gamble in the city. We'll set up all these gambling casinos, not in like the sunny desert of Las Vegas, which is, of course, the same principle, but maybe it looks a little bit more enticing. But in Detroit. Now, so we're in a dark age. Now, why do I keep saying this? Am I just like, I'm just trying to ruin your day? There's a point here. Too many people saw Trump's election in 2016 as an expression of a course correction. And Trump himself, because of retail politics, and Trump is an expert at retail everything. Whatever the guy wants to retail, whether it's sneakers, you name it, he retails it well. He's very good. He's got a good pulse in the population. He's a good salesman. He loves people. So, he retails, his success, and his economic success on the current way we measure economics was outstanding. Even in better ways of measuring it, it was outstanding. But they figured Trump won. So, yeah, there's a fascist coup against him, but not too many people in this country were aware of a fascist coup against Trump in 2016 or 2017, 2018, 2019. Maybe a few people paid attention, really. And so in 2020, even with the COVID lockdowns, there was a sense that we could pull this off. And there was clearly, we did. I mean, we won the vote, but that didn't stop them with all the mail-in ballots and everything else. So now we see that and because of COVID, we're confronted with a much more stark political reality. And there is an increased awareness that that there's a desperation to getting Trump elected. And it's absolutely accurate. And there are many really good people who have been just trying to survive and pay their bills and raise their children, or probably in many cases, raise their grandchildren, who are now realizing I've got to get more engaged, I've got to get more involved, I've got to get active, becoming precinct delegates, becoming politically active, because this is like the last best shot we got to pull this country out of this insanity. That's absolutely true. And nothing should diminish that. It's absolutely right. Trump is absolutely essential. The very questions of Western civilization, of broader transatlantic European civilization, the best of Germany, the best of France, which used to be a conspiracy to bring that to the New World, to bring that to the United States, that's at risk in this election. Stabilizing this kind of global migration pattern, as if somehow you don't have to build these other nations, just continue to wreck them, and then just flood the population into places that do have some money. Okay, we all see that game's over. Trump called it out in 2016. It's clearly on the ballot this November. And it's insanity. They're trying to literally by bringing in tens of millions of illegal voters. That's part of a big factor here. That's why it can't be stopped. It can't be shut down from the standpoint of Biden and the regime. So we've got huge obstacles, and all of these obstacles mean that you can't take the election of Trump for granted. As much as all the demographic points, all of the kind of charts you'd look at in terms of voter orientation, priorities, economy, migration, inflation, the wars, jobs, Trump wins on almost all of those by large numbers. And none of that means anything at this point because it's a completely different level of political warfare, let alone the fights that Trump faces in the legal fight. So if your primary concern is the very immediate question of getting Trump elected, no one can tell you that that's wrong. Anybody does tell him to, fly a kite, because they have no sense of reality at all. It's absolutely existential. Now, that said, getting Trump elected will not pull us out of a dark age in and of itself. We're not in a political crisis. We're not at an economic breakdown. We're not simply at a turning point of our culture. You are living in a dark age right now. We've had 2 cases recently of men burning themselves up in protest of various questions. The level of self-harm, the level of suicide, the level of identifying with psychological disorder is the predominant basis of young people, whether it's sexual dysphoria, if it's whatever neurotic psychological disorder you can imagine, ADHD, anxiety disorders, depression disorders. And you can spend a lifetime building a zoo of these categories, but that's not going to solve anyone's problem. But we do have to admit that these are clear signs when your entire younger generation are dominated by these characteristics, where hormone levels of men are like 20% of what they were just 40, 50 years ago on average. You go, wait a minute, this is a dark age. Life expectancy is collapsing. God, and you're thinking to yourself, this guy's a real downer. I say this because to solve a problem, you have to be willing to address it. You can't solve a problem that you don't identify. If it's a real problem, it has to be identified for what it is and where its cause is, and to the extent it exists. And this is the question of a true Socratic or Platon, Plato, Socrates, Socratic conception of getting at the truth, confronting the truth as it is, sobering up the American people. Right? Look how bad it really is. Now, a lot of people know it's pretty bad. So you can't necessarily just convince them it's bad. That's why I'm putting it into the category of dark age. Because when you're in a dark age, what does that mean? It means you're losing civilization. The question of civilization is not alive in people's minds. If you have overwhelming anxiety, there's one thing you attempt to do every day, and that is lower your anxiety. You don't think about the future. You don't think about your grandchildren. You don't think about what you're building. You think about one thing, probably self-medicating that anxiety. If it's depression, whatever it is. So those among us who have the ability to think about these bigger issues and see them unfolding have to be able to create a dialogue and a discussion process that begins to penetrate of how are we going to build out of a dark age? And trust me, we are not the only ones discussing this. Maybe the only ones discussing it in such blunt and direct terms. But many institutions, at least individuals within those institutions, whether it's the US military, which is trying to recruit like 300-pound lesbian, tattooed, 200 different piercings, whose best skill is how to play like Super Mario Brothers or Tetris and sit on their bed all day, and they're trying to recruit them into the US military. That doesn't work. Right? Anybody in that institution is thinking to themselves, this is a dark age, whether they say that or not. This is an unviable military process. This is an unviable society. The problem is that people in the military don't have the scope, training to consider how you build out of such a problem. They know what standards you need to meet. Some maybe do at some level. They have approximations, like a laser defense system, like Trump's revival of the SDI. But the underlying point is you have to begin to build aspects of society that young people can be proud of building. That you could ask a young person, I want you to spend the next 50 years building this. Building this bridge, building this nuclear power plant or fusion power plant, building a lunar base, a manned lunar base on the moon as a subway, as a station for deployment into Mars, to building up a viable, real healthcare system with a new culture around medical training, building beautiful cathedrals, building beautiful poets, playwrights, building up real culture. We don't need more talking heads. Ironically, here we are, a talking head. But we have a proliferation. We have millions of talking heads. Some kind of strange media class. But what are we actually accomplishing with all of this? With all of the social media? You have to begin to take on big physical endeavors, ones that seem impossible, like the moon and Mars, like building NWAPA, a water system that would collect water in Canada and Alaska and bring it down to Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Mexico. Kerry Lake recently said we've got to look at the water problem. How do we get more water into Arizona? There's one place to get it. It's Alaska and Canada. And the project's been designed. It would require satellite imagery to understand the scope and design of the project. You could only see it from geospatial orbit perspective. Huge continent-wide projects. Massive. It's not simply because these things would be good to do. It's that without doing these kinds of projects, what might have been the cathedrals in the 1200s of Europe as it finally began to emerge out of the Middle Ages. Part of it's just population density. That was part of the problem in Europe. After Rome collapsed, you barely had an ability to produce, the basic equipment in steel and iron and metal foundries that the empire had supported. But we have that similar problem today in terms of industry. But you don't rebuild industry by piecemeal. You don't rebuild a society by compromise with the Federal Reserve or with all the other private equity programs. You have to think at the highest possible level of what will be truly useful, physically useful for 4 generations from now. That what we build today will be a foundation to build what they build a century from today. That's how the great cathedrals were built. They took often over 100 years before they were crowned with things like Brunelleschi's dome. And you set a standard. You build and nourish within a younger generation a sense that your life is going to mean more than almost any lives that have existed, because you are going to set a platform for a future human civilization, for a future United States that will exist for 1,000 years because of what you're building today. Not a 1,000-year kind of ideology of Nazi Third Reich, but building the water infrastructure, the rail transportations. Trump has called for building 10 new cities. He's called for rebuilding the old cities. We should rebuild the old ones. But you're going to figure out how to rebuild old ones when you're building at least some brand new ones. Because starting from old, ask any builder, trying to rebuild on top of a completely 100-year-old house is much different than just starting from scratch and building a brand new home. And the ability to build cities. Think of the city of Athens. Go back to Solon of Athens of 600 BC, where he's given the power to rebuild the Athenian constitution. He ends slavery, but he doesn't strip the wealthy of their power. He just ends the system of debt slavery that had come to exist and predominate. He frees the slaves, empowers the working class, but continues to give the wealthy their due influence. And he tries to build a stable structure. But think of the city of Athens today. Now, I've never had the joy or privilege of going there, but the Parthenon, the same places that Solon, Socrates, and Plato walked, the streets and temples they worshipped and had their discussions in, the marketplaces. The city they built is still a thriving city today. Cities themselves, like great cathedrals, can last over 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years. Do we think of Detroit, Oakland, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, or even New York or San Francisco? Houston? Was Houston built with the idea that this city would last 3,000 years? Anybody that's been to Houston knows there was no thought put into that. Nor was Los Angeles. It's just freeways everywhere. They even made their freeways in Houston, the drainage facilities, which, I still can't completely comprehend if that was the best option. I'm sure some people can give me that there were probably some better ideas. We don't think that way. Why? Because post-World War II, we thought in superficial terms. We thought in appearances. And it's going to be not too far from today where it'll be 100 years since that war. What have we built? We were the most powerful economy in the world ever in 1945. What did we build? What can we be proud of today? Is there anything? A smartphone? We don't even make it here. We just design it and do the software. But it's impressive. It's also very distracting, but it's impressive. But it's hard pressed to say what we're building. Trump called for building 10 new cities. LaRouche promoted the NWAPA project, the Mars colonization, lunar colonization. We need to build massive energy plants, but we have to recognize that why we're doing this is not simply to meet some physical needs of people who are going to be hungry, or that you have the industry for our national security. All of that's true. But we're doing it to reawaken the quality of immortality, of moral creative powers, the moral creative force of the mind of a human individual. Because that's how you overcome the neuroses. That's how you overcome the psychological disorders. And with that creative power, once that's lit, once the mission is set forth, you can build out of any problem. There is no problem this universe has created that the mind of man cannot grasp. It is that quality of the divine in man to solve problems. It's God's greatest joy to watch us solve problems by our own free will. Not because we had to, we're not automatons, we're not programmed, but for some reason, out of a love of God, out of a love of creation, and a love of mankind, when these creative powers are awakened, there is no problem we can't solve. This has to be awakened, and it has to be intended to. You don't win a war by throwing bullets at an enemy. You don't win a fight in a caged ring by just deciding to throw some punches or outlast somebody. If you're going to go to war, and as a famous quote, life on earth for man is a war. If you're going to go to war and win, it's by intent. If you want to escape or defeat the Dark Ages, you have to intend to fly out of them, to have the kind of escape velocity to avoid the black hole of the Dark Age. And it's that which has to motivate what Trump's capable of doing. To speak in terms outside the political rhetoric, outside the talking head rhetoric, outside the reaction to all the events, staged events, and probably most, if not all of the events, are almost nearly staged at some level. But not to react to those, to set a vision in the minds of the people we're engaging with. That it's far worse than they even think it is, because they haven't considered the full scope or depth of the problem, but that the ability to get out of it can be reignited. It's a natural, fundamental principle of the universe and of human existence. That's what this is. That's the very conception that has driven the success of Western civilization. That's what drove Washington, Franklin, and Lincoln to think that such a nation could be built. And so this is the defining factor, this concept to me. And I think it certainly was to Mr. LaRouche. And I say that for those of you who can attend, we are holding a conference on June 8th in the Detroit area. And if you think this is correct, if you have a sense that we need more discussion of this nature, then I insist that you come for that Saturday and participate in real in-person discussion. It'll be broadcast, it'll be put on the internet in some form, but there will be no replacement for the physical participation there in real dialogue about how we are going to build a new renaissance out of this current dark age. And because of the intent to do that, we have taken the first step to make that mission a total success. So that's what I wanted to say tonight. Hopefully it was worth something, your time at least. And maybe we can get some dialogue and discussion, Keisha. So let's see.